Hey guys, Steve Moran here. Welcome to another episode of Foresight TV. I have Joel Goldman with us, who knows more about the law and senior living than anybody I know in the whole world. We are going to have a conversation about a couple of really interesting things. I will tell you, we are going to talk a little bit about the criminal action that was filed against Silver Auto. Not a lot, but we're going to tackle that as part of our conversation. But before that, we are going to start with this. Hey guys, Steve Moran here. Joel, welcome. I'm so glad you're joining us today. I actually have one more piece of housekeeping I have to do before we get started. This particular show is brought to you by the Senior Living Executive Conference, which is the official meeting for Argentum. And what's really, really cool is if you put the word Foresight in, I don't know whether it has to be in caps or not. I assume it'll work either way, but put it in by caps and just in case, it'll give you $100 off your registration. And who can't use an extra $100? Joel, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
So let's start with who you are. There are going to be a lot of people who are watching who already know who you are, but there are going to be some who likely won't.
Sure. So I'm a partner with the law firm of Hanson Bridget. I've been at the firm since, I hate to admit it, but since 1980. And for the past 30 plus years, my practice has focused almost exclusively on representation of senior care providers, particularly assisted living, on a wide range of licensure, regulatory, and operational issues.
Cool. And so we talked a little bit about what we were going to talk about, and the place you talked about that you particularly wanted to talk about, and I think is so important, is not exactly a legal issue, but it I guess ultimately leads to legal issues, and that is executive directors. You unfortunately or fortunately get to see the aftermath oftentimes of what things go wrong, which gives you this eagle eye view. And so I'd love to have you just talk about kind of your thoughts on executive directors, what makes great executive directors and not so great.
Sure. As you said, Steve, look, an executive director is going to make or break a building. Ultimately, they're the ones who are responsible for the well-being of the residents. Marketing is directly affected by how strong an ED is. And just quick story, this is going back a good 20 plus years. I was doing a training session for a mid-sized company, and we had, I don't know, maybe 18 to 20 executive directors sitting around a table. And I asked the question, I'm not sure what inspired me to ask it. I think it was just pure curiosity. I said, how much time do you spend in your office versus being out and about in the community? And I was expecting kind of a uniform response. If you had asked me to guess, I would have said 50-50. And I would have expected the outliers to be maybe 40-60 in either direction. And what I got was a widely disparate response from, oh, I'm almost never in my office, to I'm in my office 80% of the time. And what was remarkable was if you had charted the percentage of time that the ED was in their office and compared that to the problems, the licensing problems that the community had, there was an almost perfect correlation. It's just so important for the executive director. And I realize it's a tough job. You're wearing all these different hats. There's all this paperwork. There's phone calls to make. But I think it's imperative for folks to be out there with their team, with their residents, with the family members. And I've just seen that play out ever since. There's a direct correlation between the active engagement of the ED and how successful the community is.
So one of the things that is really fast. Couple questions. So the first thing is that I've always felt, and I've written about this, it's been a number of years, but I've always felt that if I were a corporate level leader and I had an executive director who was underperforming, that I'd actually require them to move their office out into the common areas, and that they would have to stay there until they got their occupancy back up to above 90% or something like that, recognizing there are going to obviously still be times where they've got to go in and do private things. But one of the questions I have is, do you see some, and this may not be, you may tell me you can't answer this, but do you see any correlation in terms of corporate ownership? Because I think what I hear from people is that in some big corporate environments, they have so many paperwork requirements and reporting requirements and meeting requirements that it's really hard to get out on the floor, or is that just an excuse?
It's hard for me to say. And look, again, I appreciate just how many different functions an executive director has to undertake in a given day. But I do think that's something of an excuse. I think it's imperative to find ways to not have that paperwork bog you down. Maybe some of the paperwork can be delegated. I think too often there's the tendency to hole up in the office and do the paperwork. Again, you have to lead by example. Let me tell one other quick story, and I'll give attribution on this one. A gentleman named Ron Covert. Ron was the executive director of a large upscale CCRC. Prior to that, he had been in the Air Force, career Air Force general. He had run bases, and he was touring the community with some folks, and I was there. And as we're walking down a corridor, we come to an intersection, and he says, "Excuse me," and he walks off to his left 20, 30 feet, bends down, picks up a gum wrapper, sticks it in his pocket, comes back, and he kind of mutters. He said, "I learned when I ran an Air Force base, if you won't do it, your team won't do it." And thought that was just a great little microcosm of leading by example.
So I'm so glad you brought him up. It's a funny thing. He actually, my wife actually ran the assisted living portion of Air Force. What was Air Force Village West? It's not that called anymore. So Ron was her boss, and so I know Ron. Long history. Haven't talked to him for many years, and I just think that I would say that I see, and I'm sure what you're saying is same thing, is that I see near 100% correlation. If you have a high performing building, high occupancy, staffing is working well, it's always because there's a great executive director. And if it's not performing well, I don't know that I've ever been into a building. I'm sure there are a few exceptions, but I don't know that I've ever been into any building where it's struggling and the executive director is excellent. So I probably just insulted a few people here, and oh well. I just think that this is such an important thing, and I think that the sort of the listening skills are hugely important.
Yeah, Steve, I would agree. There's no one personality type that makes for a successful executive director. I've seen some of the best EDs who are introverts, and others who are extremely outgoing and extroverted. But one of the common denominators is communication and the ability to listen.
So, what are some of the big legal issues that you're seeing?
So, falls, Steve, continues to be the number one source of people getting into trouble with the regulators and people getting sued. Falls are inevitable. I guess I see two things going on that sort of exacerbate the problem. First of all, I think that as an industry, we do a bad job of creating realistic expectations, particularly with respect to falls. in any business, if you create unrealistic customer expectations, you're going to have disappointed customers. And for us, that's going to lead to regulatory problems, lawsuits, bad legislation. If you're running a building, it's going to lead to just excessive complaints. And particularly when it comes to falls, we sometimes create misleading impressions and leave families with the impression that mom is going to stop falling when she moves to an assisted living community. And we all know that that's not the case at all. To the contrary, just the confusion of the move may make falls even more likely. So I think that, one, we've got to create realistic expectations. Don't use the term fall prevention. We can't prevent falls. We can brag about the programs we have, exercise, having a pharmacist review medications for potential drug interaction, but we don't want to leave anyone with the impression that their loved one is going to stop falling simply because they move into assisted living. Then the second problem is when you get, and I see this come up constantly in dealing with the regulators, where my client will get cited or worse for a fall with a serious injury. And when you go back and look at the resident's history, you'll see that there were numerous falls and not very good documentation of interventions. My advice would be every time a resident falls, there should be communication with the resident's representative, communication with the resident, him or herself. Sometimes we forget to include them in the process, and you may have occasionally a resident who has dementia to the point where they can't really actively participate, but most residents can. Resident's position with their representative, with the resident, and then adjust the care plan. And let me just give one example of what not to do. This was a resident who fell 20 times. Their chart showed 20 separate falls. After each fall, there was a notation in the resident's care plan, and I'm going to read it to you. It said verbatim, every 20 out of 20, it said, quote, ensure and evaluate approaches specific to resident for effectiveness as it relates to resident fall management program. And if you had trouble understanding that, it's because it's just a bunch of gobbledygook. It was basically saying after each time, it basically said implement a fall plan, but there was nothing ever implemented. It was just a rubber stamp of this, 15, 20 words that were pretty meaningless. That single episode led to a license revocation action by the Department of Social Services in California.
Wow. And I would assume that just leaves you wide open for a lawsuit as well. I mean, so I think the pushback's going to be right that I've got somebody who's falling every day. You want me to document that every time and make an adjustment every time? Look,
there can be times where there's no adjustment needed, and that's fine, but the care plan should reflect. Mrs. Smith fell. It appeared to be an anomaly because the floor was slippery. We're just going to check and make sure that the floor is mopped or whatever. But yeah, even if someone's falling every day, we can. And Steve, that's the problem. You get to the point, you've got a resident who keeps falling, and I think people sometimes just sort of shrug. Oh well, there goes Joel. He's a flopper. We're just going to accept that as sort of being the norm. It's not going to fly. It's not going to fly from a regulatory standpoint or from a litigation standpoint.
Well, and I think there's a third factor. I worry a lot that we don't pay enough attention to sort of the social messaging that as it impacts occupancy. And I think that if you don't deal with those things, that it just sets you up for somebody to say, hey, those guys don't really care. And ultimately, what we're selling is care. over the last few months, I've had opportunity to talk to a bunch of residents, mostly living in independent living. And one of the questions I ask them is, why did you move into senior living? So these are people who made choices, right? These are not assisted living where they, or memory care where they had to. And every single one of them, with one exception of one building that was a real high-end lifestyle building, every single one of them said they moved in because they knew they were getting more frail and they were doing it to help protect their physical safety. And I think that sometimes we underestimate how important that sort of global physical safety is in terms of how we message. So I get somebody who's moving in, and in my conversation with the family and perhaps with the resident themselves, I learned that falls are already a problem. What does that conversation actually look like when they're moving in?
Well, again, Steve, you're correct that safety and security is typically the number one reason. It's the number one reason that IL people move to IL, and it's the number one reason that people move to AL, whether they're the decision maker or whether a family member is. The conversation needs to be honest. When you ask the question, Steve, why are you thinking of moving your mom into assisted living? Well, she's fallen a lot at home. What you don't want to do is say, well, let me tell you about our fall prevention program, because that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, creates this unrealistic expectation. Instead, the conversation should be something along the lines, well, we can't prevent falls, but here are some of the things that we can do. I mentioned this earlier. We have an exercise program. We're going to try to get her up and walking as much as possible to build up strength in her legs so that she's less likely to fall. And we can also talk about the emergency call systems that we have in place, but we have to be careful there too, because that can create unrealistic expectations. Depending on the system, if it's a pendant system, chances are at least pretty good they'll be able to push the button. But if it's a pull cord on the wall and they fall out of reach, they may not be able to even get to the call button. And then we need to be realistic about what the response times are.
So it sounds like there's a lot of disclosure. I have a good friend of mine who's one of the finest senior living salespeople I know. He sells middle income, mostly independent living, but some assisted living, depending on the building. He's a contract guy, so he moves from building to building. And one of the things that he does that I have great admiration for is that as he's talking to prospects, he sets reasonable expectations for what life in senior living is going to be like. And what's very unusual, I don't know that I've ever heard anybody else even talk about that, is when he's talking about the dining services, he says, look, you're going to get 3 meals every single day. There's going to be variety. It's going to be healthy. But it's a little bit like living at home. There are going to be some meals that you're in love with, some that are okay, and some, frankly, that you don't like very much, in which case there are always sort of standby alternatives. But if you come into it expecting that you're going to get 4-star dining at every meal every day, this is not the place for you. That's not going to happen. And then, of course, he'd probably typically add, and if other places are honest, you're never going to get that in any other building, no matter where you go. And so I think that that expectation setting is so important. And then I assume documenting that.
Absolutely. Again, Steve, you're echoing what I'm saying about that, creating the realistic expectations. Another real quick story right along those lines. A resident moved into one of my clients' communities. She was, from the moment she got there, was difficult. And mostly, well, when she moved in, she was asked why she was moving from a competitor. And this was a reputable competitor.
Right.
And her answer was, I couldn't stand the food. And they admitted her, notwithstanding the fact that they had just hired the chef from the community that she had just left.
Oh no!
And you sort of wonder now, what did they think that that somehow he had gone on America's Worst Chefs and learned how to cook in the intervening 2 weeks or whatever, and that ties into a point that I know you and I have discussed this a number of times over the years, and that is red flags at the admission process. I mean, we spent a lot of time in our law firm helping our clients extricate themselves from really difficult residents, or more likely, really difficult families. And so often, those red flags appeared at the time of admission. And the number one red flag is someone who's moving from a competitor that is reputable. If they didn't like it at community A, the chances of them liking it at your community are pretty slim. And when you have someone again, it's usually the family member rather than the resident, him or herself, but during the interview process, if they're being rude, if they're being obnoxious, if they're being demanding, questioning, it's not going to get better after they move in.
That's right.
That's when they're on their best behavior.
Yeah. Well, when my mom was in a nursing home for about 7 days, it was hell on earth. We made the decision after looking at a number of buildings to move her into a small 6-bed here in Sacramento area, and very nice place. And I knew the owner. He had invited me over to tour, and I called him up and I said, I want to move my mom in. I knew we talked, he had a bed, and he said, I'm not sure I want you. And I sort of stepped back and I said, why? He said, well, I'm afraid you're going to write bad things about me. And so we had to work through that. So I was a red flag. And the company is all seasons, totally is still a regular reader watcher. So I'm hoping here it's wonderful. And it was a wonderful experience. And they set proper expectations and they did everything right. I remember one time my mom was, had significant cognitive damage from a stroke, and they called me up one time saying your mom just won't bathe, and they walked me through, and I already knew, and it was just good because they addressed the hard realities. We got a bunch of other things I want to talk about. Let's talk about. I want to touch briefly on. You talked about call systems already. I'd like to. It's an area that I'm really passionate about. I want to talk about the knock shift too.
Okay.
And then we'll get to Silverado.
Sure. Let me start with my sort of diatribe on call systems. Back in 1957, I was less than 3 years old, had minor surgery, but in those days, mine was for a hernia repair. It was in the hospital. It's one of my earliest vivid memories. It was lying in bed, having a call button, pushing the call button, having someone on the other end say, what is it, Joel? I need a glass of water. Okay, someone will be there in a few minutes. That was 1957. Fast forward to the 1960s, my school had a PA system, Joel Goldman to the principal's office, and the teacher said he's on his way. Two-way communication. Here we are 50, 60 plus years later. We've spent billions of dollars collectively on call systems that don't have the most important technology, and that is the ability to two-way communicate. So as a result, our caregivers are constantly put in this position of should I stay or should I go? Two quick examples. I know we're running short on time, but I'll be brief. One, the resident who was a habitual cry wolf would press the call button for everything and anything. Find my remote control, where are my slippers, whatever. And her call light goes off right around shift change. The outgoing shift sees that, oh, it's Betty. She's probably just asking for her remote, and they don't bother to check on her. And the incoming shift sees that Betty's call light is on, and again, figures it's probably nothing, and they take their time. And by the time someone arrives 20, 30 minutes later, she's dead. Whether it could have been prevented with more timely response, who knows? And then the converse was a situation where a caregiver was assisting a resident with toileting. Her pager goes off, indicating that a gentleman 2-3 doors down has pushed his call button. She tells the resident on the toilet, just stay there. I'm just going to check on Mr. Smith. I'll be back, momentarily. Goes to check on the guy 3 doors down. It turns out it's not an emergency. She comes back a minute later. The resident has gotten up, tried to get off the toilet by herself, fell, broke her hip. All downhill there. In each situation, if there'd been the ability to have a two-way call, that wouldn't have happened. I really think we've got to start looking at newer technology. I know that some of my clients are now working with Amazon to put two-way communication in. And I think that will make a huge difference.
Yeah.
It'll save time and money, and it will lead to better care.
Yeah, I envision a time where all call systems will actually be voice activated. I know that there's some concern that, there's some cases where voice might not work, but honestly, even with pennants and pull cords today, there are some cases where they fail, where somebody can't push a button or pull a cord. And so there's not going to be anything that's perfect. But to me, voice, the pieces all seem to be there. And I know there are going to be some regulatory issues that would go with that. Night shift.
Night shift. Yeah. The joke that I've used in many a presentation is that the only words in the English language that make me shudder more than the word knock shift are adult assembly required. That goes to my technical skills. Look, Steve, we know that bad stuff happens on the knock shift. It's in some cases, many of these people are working multiple jobs. We've had instances of people falling asleep on the night shift, of people not showing up and not telling anyone about it. Just recently had a client let me know that this was an all memory care building. The AM shift comes in. They can't find anyone. There's supposed to be 2 caregivers there. They can't find them. They search. Finally, someone checks, and there was a respite apartment. And they open the door, and they find the 2 of them together, naked in bed, with an empty bottle of vodka on the nightstand. Now, thankfully, no one was hurt. I mean, you hate to think what could have happened. Okay, so what can we do? We can't eliminate the night shift. It's essential. Simple trick. And if folks are listening, you've heard me say this before. It's so easy. You take in your community whatever number of managerial positions you have. In a typical AL building, depending on the size, it may be as few as 4 or 5, maybe as many as 8, 10, or even 12. Whatever the number, you agree that each person, once every 2 months, once every 3 months, will come into the building during the middle of the night. And not, hey, I'm here to spy on you, but hey, Steve, I'm Joel. I'm the activity director. I never get to see you. How are things going? I brought you some pizza. Do you have any suggestions for what we could do to make things, easier for the night shift? And let's put it this way, if that team that wound up, drunk in bed, passed out, if they had thought there was a possibility that a manager was going to show up at 3 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, I don't think we would have had that situation.
Yeah. And I think so much of this is, figuring out tricks, I guess maybe sounds negative, but I think ways to do that in a positive way, as you discussed, is so important. Let's talk a little bit about what happened with Silverado this last week. I think the whole industry was frankly just shocked and horrified when the district attorney for Los Angeles County announced that they were charging criminally executives at Silverado with manslaughter. I wrote about it earlier this week. We published it on Sunday night. It pisses me off. It horrifies me. It's scaring the bejesus out of executives for good reason. I know they're a client of yours, and I would like to add that we're having this conversation with their blessing to do that. And one of the things I'm going to sort of turn it over to you to just talk a little bit about it. But one of the things that I've been asked several times is, are there things that we as the industry can do to help support them? Are there things that individuals in the industry can do to help support or lobby? And so that's sort of going to set the stage that way.
Sure. Well, first of all, yeah, it was a shock. I felt like I was punched in the gut. I think the whole industry has, felt that way. For me, it's more personal. I've known the three individuals. I've known Jason Russo for many, many years. One of the best executive directors that I've run into. Kim Buttram, who's the corporate nurse for Silverado, outstanding professional. And, Lauren Shook, I've known for, it's got to be 20, 25 years now. In addition to being a client, I would consider him a friend. No one that I know is more passionate about assisted living than Lauren. He's been a pioneer in memory care. He has always been willing to jump in and do things for the good of the industry, whether it's partnering with teaching hospitals on research, sharing Silverado's successes and failures with trade associations, active involvement in trade associations. Lauren and I served on the CALA board together for many years. In terms of what can be done, well, first of all, I think that the allegations are absurd given just the uncertainty. This was March of 2020. None of us knew exactly what we were doing. And the allegation is that they knowingly admitted someone who basically presented a danger. The resident was coming from having been in isolation in a psychiatric hospital for 47 days. It was Mount Sinai Hospital, and they had no COVID cases. He had no symptoms at the time that he was admitted. There was no ready access to testing. The home test kits were not something that was available for quite some time after that. What can people do? First of all, I know that the individuals have appreciated the kind words, Steve. They appreciated your article. They've appreciated the emails that they've gotten from people who have reached out. I'm happy to say that I have not heard rumblings of, from people in the industry saying, "Oh, well, they should have done, something different or whatever." I think that, not second guessing is helpful. And then I don't know. I don't know whether there's anything that can be done on any kind of an organized basis, but I think that when folks have the opportunity to speak publicly, whether it's to the media or whatever, just to emphasize what things were like for us in early 2020. And I would just add, Jason Russo, as the executive director, he was in the building. He was there every day. He was putting himself at risk.
That's right.
And having law enforcement kind of now Monday morning quarterbacking with 2020 hindsight, I think is really unfortunate. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a gut punch, right? Here are these people who put their lives at risk to be there to provide care for these residents, and really, I mean, we've heard stories of so many team members who really gave their life for people who had COVID to try to do the very best, and the gut punch of this is just. And we've seen it, this hits home for me because it's California, it's people I know, but even as I know there've been some actions against that initial nursing home up in Washington state where the first cases appeared, and the behavior and the talk has been like they had all the answers. And I would say even now we don't have all the answers. We certainly have a lot more than we did now. And so much of it was caused by, factors that the communities had no control over. It just and beyond sort of the immediate impact of the people who are being charged, the thing I worry about is it's an insult to the people who are working in that community, the people who are working in our industry, and I'm terrified, wondering how many families are going to see stories like that and say, well, I better not put dad in senior living. And in doing so, they've done great damage to loved ones. And I don't feel like any of that mattered in this circumstance in terms of making these charges.
Yeah, and it has a chilling effect on other industry professionals. I mean, if you're a nurse and you're thinking, my gosh, they're charging someone who is very, very highly respected. So like, well, why would I want to do this? Why would I want to put myself at risk? And the last thing we can afford as an industry is to lose good people. As it is, there's a huge workforce shortage from caregiver through executive director level, and anything that turns people off to wanting to work in senior care ultimately is detrimental to the residents. Who law enforcement is supposed to be protecting.
Yeah. Well, Joel, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate your wisdom. I appreciate your practical approach to senior living. And I will tell you just one more sort of a final note. You told the story at least one time about the resident who spilled stuff on the tray. And it's with credit, of course, it's a story that I love because I think it so illustrates how you can think about resident care and resident dignity in the wrong way or the right way. So I appreciate your passion for the industry. I appreciate your friendship. And thank you very much for watching. We will see you next week.